On a warm January afternoon in 1947, a man sat in a lounge chair by the pool of his mansion on Palm Island, Miami Beach, Florida. He was 48 years old, but he looked 70. His face, which had once been the most recognizable in America, was sunken and empty. His eyes stared without seeing. He didn't recognize his wife. He didn't recognize his son. He didn't remember his own name. According to his doctor, he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. 2 decades earlier, this same man had been the most powerful, richest, and most famous criminal in the United States. He had controlled an empire that generated $100 million a year, the equivalent of more than $1.5 billion today. He had owned Chicago. He had bought mayors, judges, police officers, and senators. He had ordered the murders of dozens of rivals. And he had been adored by millions of Americans who saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood, a man of the people who gave them what the government denied them: entertainment, alcohol, and a show worth watching. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. The world knew him as Al Capone. The press called him Scarface. And this is his complete story. Not the Hollywood version. Not the simplified myth. This is the real life of the man who invented modern organized crime in America and who paid for it with his own mind. Get comfortable. Turn down the lights. Because this story begins far from Chicago, on a ship full of immigrants crossing the Atlantic. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in the Brooklyn neighborhood of New York. His parents, Gabriele and Teresina Capone, had emigrated from Naples, Italy in 1893, seeking a better life in the New World. They arrived with no money, no connections, and without speaking English, like millions of Italians who crossed the Atlantic between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Gabriele was a barber. Teresina took care of the home and a family that kept growing. Al was the 4th of 9 children. The family lived near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, in a dense, noisy, and overcrowded neighborhood, inhabited mainly by recently arrived Italian and Irish immigrants. The streets were narrow, the apartments were small, and life, for a resource-less immigrant family, was a daily struggle for survival. But the Capones were not a dysfunctional or particularly troubled family. Gabriele worked hard at his barbershop. Teresina kept the house with discipline and affection. The children went to school. They were, in almost every sense, a typical immigrant family in early 20th century Brooklyn, striving to build something in a country that treated them with a mix of indifference and contempt. When Gabriele's barbershop prospered enough, the family moved to a slightly better neighborhood on Garfield Place, an area with a stronger Irish presence. Ironically, it was after moving to this more respectable neighborhood that young Al began to get into trouble. The streets of Brooklyn at that time were full of youth gangs, groups of boys who engaged in vandalism, petty theft, and territorial fights. They were not sophisticated criminal organizations. They were gangs of children and teenagers who grew up on the street because the street was the only place where there was anything to do. Al first joined the South Brooklyn Rippers and later the 40 Thieves Juniors, 2 youth gangs in the neighborhood. He was a big kid for his age, strong, with huge hands and a physical presence that intimidated others. But he was also charismatic, with an easy smile and a natural ability to win people over. This combination of brute strength and personal charm would be the foundation of his entire criminal career. In school, Al was a mediocre student, but not particularly troublesome, at least not at first. Everything changed when he was 14. He punched a teacher who had reprimanded him. He was expelled and never set foot in a classroom again. His formal education had ended. His other education, the one that mattered on the streets of Brooklyn, was about to begin in earnest. After leaving school, Capone worked a series of legitimate jobs: candy store clerk, pin setter in a bowling alley, munitions factory worker, cutter in a book bindery, They were hard, poorly paid jobs with no future. For an ambitious, impatient young man surrounded by illegal opportunities, the temptation was irresistible. It was during this time that he met the two men who would change his life. The first was Frankie Yale, a gangster from South Brooklyn who ran bars, gambling houses, and extortion operations. Yale hired the young Capone as a bouncer and enforcer in one of his establishments, the Harvard Inn, a seedy bar in Coney Island. It was there that Capone received the wound that would give him his most famous nickname. One night, he made an inappropriate comment about the sister of a customer named Frank Galluccio. Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed him 3 times on the left side of his face. The scars never faded. From that moment on, the press would call him Scarface, a nickname Capone hated with all his soul. The second man who marked his destiny was Johnny Torrio. Torrio was a gangster of another caliber, a quiet, intelligent, and strategic man who had understood something most criminals of his time did not: that crime could be managed like a business. Torrio was not violent by nature. He preferred diplomacy to the revolver, negotiation to murder. But when violence was necessary, he did not hesitate to use it. And when he looked at young Al Capone, he saw something he liked: a kid with ambition, loyalty, and the willingness to do the dirty work. In 1918, while working for Yale, Capone met May Josephine Coughlin, a young Irish woman from a middle-class background. They married that same year, when Al was 19 and May was 21. A month later, their only son, Albert Francis Capone, known as Sonny, was born. For a brief period, Capone seemed to try to live a legitimate life. He moved to Baltimore and worked as an accountant in a construction company. But when his father Gabriele died in 1920, Capone returned to New York and resumed contact with the criminal world. And then came the call that changed everything. In 1920, Johnny Torrio had moved to Chicago to work with Big Jim Colosimo, a powerful crime boss who controlled a vast network of brothels, gambling houses, and illegal businesses. Torrio saw enormous opportunity in Chicago, especially after the government passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. It was Prohibition. And for criminals with business vision, it was the greatest business opportunity in history. Colosimo, however, was an old-world man. He controlled prostitution and gambling, and that was enough for him. He refused to enter the illegal alcohol business, considering it too risky. Torrio disagreed, and in May 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead in the lobby of his own restaurant. No one was arrested, but it is widely believed that Torrio ordered the murder, possibly with Capone as a direct accomplice, to take control of the organization. Torrio called Capone to join him in Chicago. Al was 21 years old. He arrived in a city that was about to become the stage for the greatest criminal spectacle America had ever seen. Prohibition had created an absurd economic situation. Millions of Americans wanted to drink alcohol. The government had decided they could not. The result was predictable: colossal demand and a supply that only criminals could satisfy. Whoever controlled the distribution of beer and liquor in a big city essentially controlled a gold mine. And Chicago, with its 3 million inhabitants, its tradition of political corruption, and its long history of organized crime, was the biggest gold mine of all. Torrio understood this before anyone else. He organized the production and distribution of illegal alcohol in Chicago with the efficiency of a corporate executive. He built secret distilleries. He established smuggling routes from Canada. He bought clandestine bars, known as speakeasies, where citizens could drink in secret. And, most importantly, he bought the police and politicians who were supposed to enforce the law. In Chicago during the 1920s, corruption was not the exception. It was the system. Capone learned from Torrio like a brilliant student learns from an exceptional teacher. He absorbed the lessons of organization, financial management, and criminal diplomacy. But he also brought something Torrio didn't have: a magnetic personality, almost reckless audacity, and a willingness for violence that his rivals found terrifying. In January 1925, Torrio was ambushed by members of a rival gang. He was shot several times and survived by a miracle. After recovering, he made a decision that surprised everyone. He retired. He transferred full control of his organization to the man he trusted most. Al Capone was 26 years old and suddenly became the most powerful organized crime boss in Chicago. What Al Capone built in the following 6 years was something the world had never seen before. It wasn't simply a criminal gang. It was a crime corporation, a diversified enterprise that operated with the efficiency and structure of a legitimate multinational, but with the advantage of not being subject to any law. Capone's organization, known as the Chicago Outfit, controlled practically every aspect of vice and illegal commerce in the city. They had more than 200 brothels. They controlled thousands of speakeasies. They operated secret distilleries and breweries that produced millions of liters of alcohol per year. They managed illegal gambling networks that covered the entire Midwest. And they had between 700 and 1,000 men at their service, including thugs, bodyguards, accountants, lawyers, and politicians. The revenues were astronomical. In 1927, it is estimated that Capone's organization generated approximately $100 million, the equivalent of more than $1.5 billion in today's money. Capone lived up to those figures. He settled into the Lexington Hotel, where he occupied an entire suite with bodyguards at every door. He wore custom-made suits, drove armored cars, smoked imported cigars, and sported a diamond tie pin that became his visual signature. He was, in every sense, a man who wanted to be seen. And this is where Capone differed from almost all the other gangsters of his era. He actively sought fame. He didn't avoid it. While other crime bosses hid in the shadows, Capone sat in the front row at Chicago Cubs baseball games, where the crowd gave him standing ovations. He gave interviews to newspapers. He posed for photographers. He actively cultivated the image of a generous businessman who simply gave people what they wanted. And for a while, that image worked. Capone presented himself as an entrepreneur, not a criminal. In a famous interview, he said something that perfectly sums up his philosophy. "All I do is satisfy a public demand. If I didn't do it, someone else would." It was a simple, cynical argument, and, for many Americans of the time, quite convincing. After all, Prohibition was a law that most people considered absurd, and Capone was the man providing them with the beer the government denied them. He opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression, serving free meals to thousands of unemployed people. He donated money to charities. He funded hospitals and orphanages. In Chicago's Italian neighborhoods, he was revered as a protector, a godfather who took care of his own. Children pointed at him on the street with admiration. Women asked him for autographs. But behind the smile and the benevolent headlines, there was a reality that the soup kitchens could not hide. The violence that accompanied Capone's empire was systematic, relentless, and often spectacular. Chicago in the 1920s was a city at war. Multiple gangs competed for control of the alcohol business, and competition was resolved with Thompson submachine guns, car bombs, and bodies left in dark alleys. It is estimated that more than 100 people died in gang-related attacks during the decade. Capone's main rivals were the North Side gangs, led first by Dean O'Banion and later by Jaime Weiss and George "Bugs" Moran. O'Banion was a peculiar guy, a gangster who loved flowers and ran a flower shop as a front. In November 1924, O'Banion was murdered in his own flower shop by men linked to the Torrio and Capone organization. 3 men entered, one shook his hand, and the other 2 shot him at point-blank range. It was the first act of a war that would last for years. Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's successor, tried to take revenge by attacking Torrio and then Capone himself. In September 1926, a caravan of cars drove past Capone's hotel in Cicero and unleashed more than 1,000 shots at the building's facade. Capone was inside, in the dining room, and he threw himself to the floor. He was not injured, but the message was clear. The war was not going to end with diplomacy. Weiss was murdered a month later by Capone's shooters, stationed in an apartment across from his headquarters, and then Capone decided to end the problem once and for all. On February 14th, 1929, a date that would forever be etched in America's criminal history, what the world would know as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre took place. 7 men linked to Bugs Moran's gang were lined up against the wall of a garage on Chicago's north side. The attackers were dressed in police uniforms, which made the victims cooperate without resistance, believing it was a routine raid. Once lined up against the wall, 2 men with Thompson submachine guns opened fire. The 7 men were riddled with bullets in a matter of seconds. The floor was covered in blood. The walls were perforated by hundreds of impacts. Bugs Moran, the real target, was not in the garage that day. He had arrived late and, upon seeing what he believed were police cars in front of the building, decided not to enter. He survived by pure chance. Capone had a perfect alibi. He was at his vacation home in Florida at the time of the massacre. He was never arrested for the crime, but everyone knew who had ordered it, and the reaction was devastating for him. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre crossed an invisible line. The violence of the gang wars had been tolerated by Chicago society for years, largely because it mainly affected the criminals themselves. But the brutality of the massacre, the image of 7 unarmed men being riddled against a wall, shocked public opinion. Newspapers, which had treated Capone as a colorful celebrity, began calling him Public Enemy Number 1. Influential Chicago citizens demanded action, and the federal government, which until then had treated organized crime in Chicago as a local problem, decided to intervene. Al Capone's fall did not come from murder, smuggling, or extortion. It came from taxes. It is one of the most famous ironies in criminal history. The man who had ordered dozens of murders, who had corrupted an entire city, who had defied the federal government for years, was finally brought down for not paying his tax bill. The United States government had tried to catch Capone for his violent crimes for years, but always failed. Witnesses disappeared or changed their testimony. Judges were bribed or intimidated. Evidence evaporated. Capone seemed untouchable. But a young Treasury Department agent named Elliot Ness, along with a team of federal agents known as the Untouchables, began a systematic campaign to dismantle Capone's bootlegging operations. They destroyed distilleries. They seized millions of dollars worth of beer and liquor. They shut down the outfit's most important breweries. And while Ness attacked from the outside, another team worked quietly from within. Agents from the Treasury's Special Intelligence Unit, who were building, document by document, a tax evasion case against Capone. The case was simple in its logic. Capone spent millions of dollars a year on a luxurious lifestyle, but he had never filed a tax return. He had no declared legal income. He had no properties in his name. Everything was in the names of fronts and fictitious companies. But the money flowed, and it left trails that government forensic accountants could follow. On June 5, 1931, Al Capone was formally indicted on 22 counts of federal tax evasion for the years 1925 to 1929. Initially, Capone tried to negotiate a plea deal with the prosecution. He pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence of 2.5 years. He even bragged to the press that he had closed the deal. But Judge James Wilkerson refused to accept the agreement. He informed Capone that he, the judge, was not bound by any pact between prosecutors and lawyers. Capone changed his plea to not guilty, and the case went to trial. Al Capone's trial began on October 6, 1931, in a federal courthouse in Chicago. It was a media spectacle of enormous proportions. Journalists from across the country covered every session. The public crowded the courthouse doors to see America's most famous gangster. Capone arrived each day dressed in impeccable suits, smiling at the cameras, projecting an image of confidence and control. But the confidence evaporated quickly. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Forensic accountants presented documents showing that Capone had spent colossal amounts of money with no legal source of income. Hotel records, jewelry store bills, tailor receipts, bank transfers. Everything painted an unmistakable portrait of a man who lived like a king and didn't pay a single cent in taxes. On October 17, 1931, after barely 9 hours of deliberation, the jury found Al Capone guilty on 5 of the 23 counts of tax evasion. On November 24th, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and more than $200,000 in back taxes with interest. He was 32 years old. His reign as king of crime in Chicago had lasted barely 6 years. Capone began his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in May 1932. But even there, his fame and money provided him with privileges. He had access to certain luxuries that ordinary inmates did not enjoy. He received frequent visits. He communicated with his associates on the outside. Prison authorities suspected he was still directing, at least partially, the outfit's operations from his cell. To put an end to this, the government made a drastic decision. In August 1934, Al Capone was transferred to Alcatraz. Alcatraz was a rocky island in San Francisco Bay, battered by icy winds and surrounded by water currents so cold that swimming to escape was practically suicidal. Alcatraz Penitentiary had been specifically designed to house the most dangerous and troublesome inmates in the federal system. There were no privileges. There was no influence. There was no communication with the outside world beyond what was strictly allowed by the rules. For a man accustomed to living like an emperor, Alcatraz was hell. Capone was assigned prisoner number 85. He was treated like any other inmate. He worked in the prison laundry. He ate the same food as everyone else. He slept in a tiny cell. And for the first time in his adult life, his money, his fame, and his charisma were worth absolutely nothing. But the real punishment did not come from Alcatraz's walls. It came from inside his own body. Years earlier, probably during his youth in the brothels of Brooklyn or Chicago, Capone had contracted syphilis. At the time, the disease was treatable if caught early, but Capone never sought treatment, probably out of shame or ignorance. The bacteria had spent years feeding on his nervous system, and in Alcatraz, the symptoms began to manifest with relentless cruelty. First came the mood swings, then the confusion, then the hallucinations. Capone began behaving erratically. He became disoriented inside the prison. He talked to himself. He didn't recognize the guards. One inmate once found him in his cell, strumming an imaginary banjo with his eyes lost in the void. The most feared gangster in America was being destroyed, cell by cell, by a microscopic bacterium that had been colonizing his brain for decades. In January 1939, his condition had deteriorated to the point that he was transferred to the prison hospital ward. In November of that year, he was released. He had served 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days. But the man who walked out of prison was not the same man who had entered. After his release, Capone retired to his mansion on Palm Island, Miami Beach, where he would spend his final years in a state of progressive mental decline. Syphilis, now in its tertiary stage known as neurosyphilis, had caused irreversible damage to his brain. His cognitive capacity had been drastically reduced. He could not maintain a coherent conversation. He didn't recognize friends who had been his companions for decades. He wandered the gardens of his mansion in pajamas, muttering to himself, fishing in the pool with a fishing rod that had no hook. His wife May, the Irish woman who had married him when he was a young Brooklyn thug, stayed by his side until the end. She cared for him with a devotion that painfully contrasted with the brutality of his past. She fed him. She helped him get dressed. She spoke to him gently when his eyes wandered and his mind drifted to places no one else could see. In January 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. 3 days later, on January 25th, he developed pneumonia. His body, weakened by years of illness, could not resist. Alphonse Gabriel Capone died surrounded by his family, in his bed, in his Miami Beach mansion. He was 48 years old. He did not die in a shootout. He did not die riddled by rivals or chased by the police. He died like a prematurely old man, with his mind destroyed, in the silence of a closed room. The man who had made Chicago tremble, who had defied the federal government, who had been cheered in baseball stadiums and feared on every street corner of the city, ended his days without knowing who he was. His funeral was modest compared to what it would have been in his years of glory. He was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, and later moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery, where he rests alongside other members of his family. There were no crowds. There were no parades. The man who had filled the front pages of every newspaper in America for a decade was buried in the relative obscurity of a suburban cemetery. Al Capone's legacy is more complex than the headlines suggest. It is easy to reduce him to a caricature, the gangster with the fedora hat and the cigar, the Scarface from the movies. But the reality is more nuanced and more uncomfortable. Capone did not invent organized crime in America, but he did modernize it. He was the first to apply business principles to the criminal enterprise: diversification of income, quality control, public relations, human resources management. He created a template that criminals around the world would follow for decades. The mafia, cartels, contemporary criminal organizations, all of them owe something, directly or indirectly, to the model that Capone perfected in the 1920s. He also demonstrated something deeply disturbing about American society: that a criminal can become a popular hero if he provides something people want. Prohibition was a colossal legislative failure that created the perfect conditions for men like Capone to thrive. When the government prohibits something people desire, someone will fill that void. And that someone is rarely a law-abiding citizen. The Chicago outfit survived its founder for decades. The criminal organization he had built continued to operate under different leaders well into the 21st century. The names changed, the methods evolved, but the basic structure that Capone established endured. And on the streets of Chicago, in the buildings that once housed his speakeasies and headquarters, tourists take photos and buy souvenirs with his face. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the son of Italian immigrants who dropped out of school at 14 and built a criminal empire before turning 30, has become what he always wanted to be: a legend. The price of that legend was the destruction of his own mind. But that, like so many things in his life, is a part of the story that people prefer not to remember. Thank you for listening. If you're still awake, I hope this story has given you something to think about as you close your eyes. And if you've already fallen asleep, then this documentary has fulfilled its exact purpose. In any case, good night.